Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to see you tonight. We'll be going to start in a minute. Okay, thank you. Right, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jochen Sokoly, who I think we have known each other for about 35 years since we were students at SOAS together. 37 years. Doesn't really matter. Since we were the only two students, in fact, doing the MA in Islamic art, and at that time we had to do a lot of corresponding and talking, and exactly. So it really does. I'm really delighted, and I'm delighted to see this book, which really is Jochem's magnum opus. You know, it looks, you know, it looks like one as well. It's got enough pages in it, and it's actually a very good price as well. Very good value for money, I think, compared to some of the other publishers. So, and I was privileged to read bits here and there, and I must say it's very readable. And very interesting. I'm not a great textile person, so I was a little bit nervous about it the first time when I read it, and I found it tremendously readable and lots of interesting information about all sorts of things. So I'm just going to hand over to Jochen. I should tell you that he's working at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's just been made professor, and so everything is going very well. And oh yes, and he's on the council of the Royal Asiatic Society, so and has been a long-standing member. Yeah. Okay. All right. I've got a commentary in the back. Right. Thank you very much. So Jochen, I'm going to hand over to you because this is what we're here to hear.
Well, thank you so much, Alison, for the kind introduction. And yes, it's lovely actually to be here to present something I've been working on for a very, very long time. The book that you see here, and it's actually, so I'm so sorry, we've only got one copy on the table there because they are still being printed, I think, and they'll be out. They'll be out next month in the shops. It would have been unthinkable without my doctoral work on the topic, but it is unlike my DPhil thesis focused only on one collection, which serves as a lens to look at the topic of inscribed textiles at large. And as such, it is limited in scope, but offered the opportunity to look deeper at each individual object from a variety of angles and indeed real optical lenses. It entailed going to Kuwait many, many times over the span of more than 20 years while working full-time in teaching and curating at Virginia Commonwealth University. I had almost at one point lost hope when the tragic death of Sheikh Nasser Sabah al-Ahmed in late 2020, who had been the most kind supporter, prompted me to put all my efforts into finishing this project. So what you see here today is an attempt to make sense of a topic that has been largely marginalized despite its potential to contribute to a variety of lines of inquiry: historical, archaeological, paleographic, industrial, and socio-economic. The textiles I have studied are not just textiles, but documents. Today, I will not bore you with any technicalities, but rather look at a more jolly facet of the textile world of the early Islamic period by investigating the hybrid world of dress cultures of the early Islamic period, the time of the caliphates before the Mongol invasions. And I thought I would read the first chapter of my book, which in a sense is the one that I enjoyed most writing, because it provides an overview of the subject for somebody who doesn't necessarily have all the technical background. And when you look at the book later, you will see that in the catalogue, of course, there are lots and lots of technical bits that sometimes are a little bit difficult to understand. But this, in a sense, kind of eases the way into the subject as a whole. Textiles and fashion were as important in the early Islamic world as they are today, economically and culturally. When the Caliphate stepped into the footsteps of the Byzantine Empire in many parts of the Mediterranean and the Sasanians in the Iranian world and Central Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries, they inherited textile industries and trade networks that had been flourishing for many centuries. In time, the clothing traditions that had existed in Arabia before the advent of Islam were merged with these non-Arab traditions to create a new Islamic identity in clothing and fashion that was pluralistic and differentiated by regional variations. Looking at what has survived from the early Islamic world and considering the evidence of literary sources, what emerges is a society for which textiles, fashion, and clothing were paramount. The sheer variety of surviving garments and fabrics is staggering in terms of materials, production techniques, colors, range of quality and styles, as well as their modes of decoration. This is mirrored by how historical texts discuss fabrics and clothing, variations in wording to denote minute differences between cloth types and weaves, and the array of names for particular garments. All of this going far beyond what a modern person would be accustomed to. The following discussion offers some background by highlighting historical developments in textiles and fashion, looking at surviving garments, representations of garments, and how they are described in historical texts. Before Islam, a barefoot people, naked and weak, but very brave, is how the 12th century Syriac Orthodox patriarch Michael the Syrian described the Arabs of the Islamic conquests of the early 7th century in his chronicle. Barefoot and Naked is also the title of an article by the historian Patricia Crone, in which she investigates what the Arab armies actually wore by considering textual and visual evidence. While Michael the Syrian's polemic may have been founded in his disdain for Islam and the Bedouins of the desert, Crone surprisingly comes to the conclusion that he was actually not too far off the mark. But surely the Arabs of the conquests were not all savages. Given the harsh life of the desert, with all its hardships and poverty, it is hardly surprising that fashion might not have been at the top of their priorities, and they had to scavenge whatever came their way. When they became Muslims, however, and joined the armies of the conquests, they came in closer contact with people who were already rooted in urban traditions and had access to varied goods coming from overseas, and in time became accustomed to the world of fashion as it was present in the cities of the Hijaz, such as Mecca and Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad was active. Dress in urban Arabia before Islam and during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, as it is often still is the case today, was characterized by several layers of clothing for both men and women, with minimal or no tailoring, resulting in a relatively unstructured look that covered the whole body. The fundamental elements of a female or male outfit were the following: undergarments, such as the izar, a cloth wrapped around the waist, perhaps similar to the modern-day wuzar worn in many parts of the Arabian Peninsula. The qamis, from the Latin camisia, a shirt-like long garment worn over the izar. The thob, a gown worn over the qamis, and then garments such as the jubba, a woolen tunic, a hulla, a long flowering coat, a qaba, a sleeved robe slit in front, or the farouj, similar to the kaba, but slit in the back, all of which were worn on top of everything else. Both men and women covered their heads. For men, the imama, a turban-like garment that played a much greater role later under the caliphates, was already attested, as were various veil-like cloths for women, such as the mandil, which was like a large square, as well as the qima, which covered the face, or the burqu, a cloth suspended in front of the lower face. Several hadiths mention that the Prophet Muhammad presented his own clothes to chosen companions and members of his extended family. A symbolically important precedent for the informal presentation of robes is recorded in Ibn al-Athir's Al-Kamil, in which the Prophet is reported to have taken off his burda, a type of mantle, handing it to the poet Ka'b ibn Zahir upon hearing one of his poems. The bestowal of clothes by caliphs of the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid dynasties later on upon members of their courts, dignitaries, or vassals later became a prominent extension of the caliphal status quo and a symbol of authority. When the Arabs conquered parts of the Mediterranean world and Iran, they were confronted with very established and developed systems of clothing. And this is what we can see here. On the one hand, the dress of the late Roman Empire and Byzantium is seen here by visual examples from Ravenna, Palmyra, and Egypt, with its cloaks, dalmatics, and tunics. And on the other hand, the world of Iranian and Central Asian clothing, as exemplified by the dress seen on the Sasanian reliefs at Takabustan or murals at Afrasiab near Samarkand, with their silken overcoats and baggy trousers and boots. In time, aspects of these clothing traditions were adopted and adapted by Arab and non-Arab Muslims, as we will see in the course of this presentation. Some of the earliest presentations of fashion and clothing under the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty can be found in three architectural sites that are all connected to caliphal patrons: the palace of Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi near Palmyra in Syria, the palace of Khirbat al-Mafjar on the west bank of the Jordan Valley, and the bath complex of Qasr Amra near Amman in Jordan. Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi was built under the Umayyad Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, as attested by a foundation inscription over the entrance, which dates the building to Hijri 109, which is equivalent to 727 CE. Two princely figures have survived there. One on the facade is a standing male wearing a knee-length, pleated, short shirt over baggy trousers, similar to the costume worn by Sasanian royalty. The other was once located on the second floor of the interior facade overlooking the former courtyard colonnade, and comprises a fragment of the lower half of a figure wearing a long garment over which is flung a prominently pleated toga-like wrap. The figure is seated on what is perhaps a wooden or ivory throne, with both sandal-clad feet resting on a footstool. On this figure, traces of pigments have survived, notably in red, green, and brown. While the former clearly adheres to an Eastern costume tradition, the latter is firmly in the Hellenistic tradition of the Mediterranean. A painting once covering the floor of the reception room in the palace's east wing is also of interest. It too features figures that are rooted in the Sasanian dress tradition. Two courtiers within a colonnade playing musical instruments, and below a mounted archer hunting. A small fragment of a mural from the former second floor shows the face of a curly-haired and bejeweled female figure wearing a shawl wrapped around her head, both with the ends neatly tucked away and covering her shoulders. It has been suggested that she is an Arab singer, many of whom were brought from the Hijaz to Syria to sing at the Umayyad court. Female figures are also present at Kharbat al-Mafjar, a site that has been connected to the nephew and successor of the Caliph Hisham, Walid II ibn Yazid, particularly during his time as heir apparent. Walid's accessories are described in some detail in the historical sources, and the ostentatious architecture of the palace complex at Kharbat al-Mafjar is testimony to his many eccentric personality traits in seeking a variety of physical pleasures and his love for poetry. Several surviving figures of scantily clad women sculpted in stucco from the large bathhouse wear loincloths perhaps equivalent to the izar described earlier. The cloth seen here, rolled up around the waist and then tucked in to secure it from sliding down, seems to be made of a loosely falling fabric in a color palette of dark reds and purples. Red is also a prominent color in another well-known figure from Kharbat al-Mafjar, the standing prince. The imposing figure was once located within an apsidal recess above the arched entrance to the music room of the bathhouse, much like a triumphal arch. The prince stands on a plinth supported by two seated lions, confronting the viewer. His imposing facial features, large almond-shaped eyes, half-length hair, and a well-groomed pointed beard, are complemented by his carefully curated outfit, a long red coat with a beaded border, held together with a belt at the waist, worn over a pair of darker red baggy trousers and what might have been boots. In his left, he holds onto a long sword. There is no way to say that the figure is that of Walid, as it lacks an inscription to identify it conclusively. But similar figures, often referred to as the standing caliph type, can be seen on Umayyad coinage prior to the language reform of al-Walid's grandfather Abdul Malik ibn Marwan in the 690s. The long coat worn over baggy trousers is clearly a reference to Sasanian dress customs and corresponds to the princely figure from Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi discussed earlier. If the figure is indeed that of Walid ibn Yazid, one might be tempted to see a highly confident individual with an acute sense of self-presentation and knowledge of how dress can convey notions of power. Qasr Amra, a small bath complex once part of a larger settlement in the Jordanian desert near Amman, and within the vicinity of the oasis of Al-Azraq, presents an extraordinary cycle of paintings and is also connected to Walid ibn Yazid, as suggested by an inscription recently discovered which mentions his name. The building was built sometime between 723 and 743. It consists of a multi-nave reception room to which is attached a bathhouse of Roman type. The building is decorated richly throughout with paintings that fall into the following categories: princely representation, courtly pastimes, hunting, and allegory. They are examples of the adaptation of late antique culture and iconography. Of great interest are the costumes seen in the paintings, most of which are examples of Hellenistic dress in the Mediterranean. In the central aisle of the main reception hall is a painting of a prince, identified by an inscription above as Al-Amir. He is seated on a throne below an arched colonnaded canopy wearing a multicolored robe similar to that of the princely figure at Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi discussed just now earlier. On both sides, he is accompanied by female standing figures that appear to draw a curtain. The figure on the prince's right wears a long flowing white shirt similar to a qamis, with a dark blue shawl draped over her shoulders, while the shirt of the other figure is darker. The walls along the aisle are flanked by courtly figures placed within a colonnade, most of which are dressed in long robes reminiscent of Byzantine dress. All around the central aisle are representations of dancing figures and musicians. The bearded figure of a seated lute player stands out, as he is dressed in a patterned long robe with wide sleeves and a long shawl draped over his shoulders. His face is more accentuated and naturalistic than that of the other figures, with his finely chiseled features and thin moustache, and one might assume that he represents an Arab courtier, presumably in Arab costume. A large painting in the western aisle features a barefoot prince, stretched out on a daybed in a tent, supported by bolsters. This is likely Walid, as the whole scene is below an inscription mentioning his name. And there's the, sorry, oops. There's the inscription. It's just up there. He wears a long light blue shirt with wide loose sleeves made from what appears to be a light and partly sheer fabric, and a cream-colored turban. His lap is covered by a lattice-patterned brown blanket. Two figures, perhaps female, are seated on the side of the daybed. Both wear pinkish shirts and their left shoulders draped by blankets, one in an orange-yellow, the other dark blue. Both wear tight-fitting cloths wrapped around their heads, with the ends suspended on their left sides. Behind the daybed, a figure holding a pen and a large scroll-like sheet presumably represents a scribe. His costume consists of a long dark greyish-blue dotted robe with a corresponding hemispherical hat. Over his shoulders, he wears an orange-yellowish shawl that is suspended all the way down his left side. An attendant on the end of the daybed with bare chest and wearing a loincloth operates a feathery fly whisk. While this painting and its significance within the overall program of paintings at Qasr Amra has received relatively little scholarly attention, another painting immediately, oops, that's too far. There we are. Another painting immediately adjacent to the flanking wall, on the flanking wall, has been the subject of much debate. It features a group of 6 princely figures, some identified with inscriptions, paying homage to the figure stretched out on the daybed. The painting is badly damaged but recent restoration has revealed some remarkable details previously overlooked. Of the six, one can identify the Byzantine Emperor, the Sasanian Emperor Khosrow, the Visigothic King Roderick, and the Aksumite Negus, as Oleg Rabah suggested, a family of kings. In the first row, the figure of the Byzantine emperor is dressed in a long light blue mantle patterned with an overall design of rosettes. Under the mantle, he wears a cream-colored long shirt with a brown border accentuated by small blue dots. Khosrow, whose head bears a Sasanian crown, wears a long blue robe with an indistinguishable pattern and a large pinkish cape draped over his shoulders. And you can just about make out the crown here, the Sasanian crown. Roderick's here, appears to be wearing a pair of brown trousers under a pinkish light robe. There we are, brown trousers, with a sky blue cape held together with what seems to be a jeweled clasp. And that's in the second row. The only figure that can be identified is the Ethiopian emperor, in between Khosrow and Roderick. There, in between Khosrow and Roderick, there he is, just about visible, whose clothes are not easily discernible. What seems certain, though, is that he wears a brownish robe, of which a beaded border is visible between the figures in front of him. Directly adjacent to the group of the six kings is a large fresco showing a female figure standing in a water basin, almost nude, clothed with a sheer loincloth. On her left, a group of wrestlers wearing loincloths are seen exercising. So those are the wrestlers here, and there is the lady here in the pond. Ah, sorry, wrong. Oh, there we are. Oh, I don't know why it wants to go further than I want to. In the eastern side of the reception hall, the barrel-vaulted ceiling is decorated with figures representing various trades. All are dressed in Roman-style short tunics. Below, two barefoot male figures are seen slaughtering what looks like an oryx antelope. Both wear long white shirts that are tucked in between their legs so as not to get in the way of the action. In the lunette above, two allegorical figures in Hellenistic clothing create a stark contrast to the butchery happening below. So this is above here, and that is below. Looking at all these three Umayyad sites creates an insight into how the Umayyads used dress as a political marker. The images of princes enthroned or posing seem to be symbolic of a status rather than representations of individuals. Their choice of Byzantine and Sasanian modes of dress are perhaps not necessarily a reflection of actual clothing styles, but tokens of what the Umayyads saw as imperial symbolism, accepted and universally understood idioms of royalty. It is interesting in this context how the image of the lounging prince at Qusr Amra differs from the standardized mode of the enthroned ruler, particularly the contrast to the costumes of the six kings. He and his courtiers wear clothes that set them apart from the dress culture of the conquered. It seems that they represent perhaps the first step in creating an Islamic notion of dress that amalgamated and adapted different cultural traditions, but differentiated the Muslim ruling elite from non-Muslims. we know that the Umayyads began to esteem more luxurious modes of dress than the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. The Caliph Suleiman, for example, is reported to have worn a green flowing robe with a matching turban and to have long and wide sleeves, perhaps similar to what we see at Qasr Amra. He also wore trousers, called sirwal, as part of his outfits. Walid II was known to have worn special clothes for prayer called thiyab al-khilafa, caliphal garments. The earliest dated examples of a caliphal textile are the various dispersed fragments that once belonged to a single piece and were recovered in the late 19th century from a grave in Akhmim, the ancient Panopolis in Upper Egypt. The fragments are ragged remnants of a once magnificent textile, which would have been a sheer luxury for its owner. They comprise a compound woven silk fabric with designs in mustard and muted blue on a dark red ground. It is very likely that the fragments once belonged to a large rectangular shawl, perhaps decorated with a repeat of beaded roundels and multi-lobed flowers in between, bordered at both ends with beaded bands. Importantly, two of the fragments are inscribed in an early form of Arabic script, embroidered in yellow silk between the border and the main field of roundels. The earliest surviving textile Tiraz inscription, a type of institutionalized inscription discussed in my book. The inscription follows a standard sequence mentioning the name and titles of the Caliph Marwan, stating that the piece was commissioned, ordered, followed by what appears to the lost name or title of an administrator, and then the location of the Tiraz workshop in Ifriqiya, a province spanning most of the North African Mediterranean coast. The date of the piece could fall into the reign of two Umayyad caliphs called Marwan, namely Marwan ibn al-Hakam, who ruled 684 to 5, or Marwan ibn Muhammad, who ruled 744 to 50. The last ruler of the Umayyad dynasty. And it's an inscription, as you can see there, is just that. It is really just a little fragment, and it's embroidered on top of this compound woven textile. And they're in various collections. One is in the V&A, one is in Manchester, one is in Brooklyn, another one is in Brussels. It's sort of made the rounds. It is impossible to say which of the two was the textile's patron. The epigraphic style of the inscription conforms to script styles found in contemporary papyri, linking it to Umayyad scribal practice. That the inscription was embroidered onto the compound woven silk ground fabric opens up questions of manufacture. It would have been very complicated to weave such an inscription as part of the compound weave, so it was added later. It is therefore likely that the textile was not woven in Ifriqiya, but was produced elsewhere and was later personalized. From an aesthetic point of view, the beaded roundels might point to a Sasanian influence. Indeed, references to Sasanian motifs can be found elsewhere in Umayyad art. Dye analysis performed on the fragments has been inconclusive, with some of the dyes pointing to a Mediterranean and others to an Eastern place of production. The Byzantine emperor within the group of the 6 kings at Qasr Amra that I've just talked about wears a robe decorated with an all-over pattern of rosettes. These ones here. The embroidered inscription indicates that the notion of Tiraz as a marker of administrative requisition extending to textiles was already established and clearly defined under the Umayyads, similar to the marking of state documents with a protocolon to record administrative procedure. The Abbasids. The Abbasid revolution of 750, which saw the Umayyad Caliphate overthrown, resulted in a sea change in the Caliphate's political and administrative culture. The move of the Abbasid capital to Baghdad in 762 under al-Mansur brought the Caliphate's center of gravity closer to its eastern provinces in Iran, Khorasan, and Central Asia, and opened up new opportunities for trade and industry along the Silk Road and maritime routes to Asia. The Abbasids employed mostly Persian administrators, often non-Arab Muslims, and an army of Turkish slaves, a move that resulted eventually, some 2 centuries later, in the gradual disintegration of their power. Abbasid court culture borrowed much from that of the Sasanians. Not only was their first capital located near the Sasanian capital Ctesiphon, but Abbasid architecture also looked back in its monumentality, theatricality, and visual impact to Sasanian buildings, such as the Taqi Kisra, is just still standing at that time. And only bits of it are standing today still. The idea of Baghdad as a circular city, with its caliphal palace and congregational mosque at the center, stressed the caliph's position as a singular leader of a world empire and religion. Dress and clothing played an important part in that new court culture. Dress was a marker of social status, profession, gender, and ethnic affiliation. The 10th century Baghdadian philologist Abu Tayyib Muhammad al-Washa describes in great detail the dress costumes of fashionable society in the Abbasid capital city. In his Kitab al-Muwasha, a handbook of rules of good society for the aristocrats of Baghdad, he outlines how an outfit might be composed. A fine undershirt called qilala under a heavier lined qamis, a sort of shirt of the kind we've referred to earlier, both a fine linen, tabiqi produced in Egypt, or jannabi from Iran. A lined mantle referred to as dhurra from Alexandria, or a jubba from Nishapur in linen, silk, or mulham, a mix of cotton and silk. And finally, a Yemeni cloak from Aden called rida, or a mitraf from Sus in Iran with decorative borders. The head was clothed with a turban referred to as taylisan of Nishapuri mulham. Al-Washa's discussion on male dress codes is generally more encompassing than that of female dress. His descriptions provide some insight into fabrics and their color, for example, discussing striped and banded linen and colored qasab, a linen decorated with gold or silver, decorated with silk embroidered roundels. Caliphs would often present clothing to chosen courtiers as a sign of close companionship, but also to mark investiture to public office. This was called the khil'a, already practiced under the Umayyads, but institutionalized by the Abbasids. Such an outfit often consisted of exactly what a fashionable citizen of Baghdad wore as described just now, and came in different ranges of value depending on rank. The sources are full of anecdotes regarding how caliphs and their viziers dressed according to their particular preferences. Ibn al-Furat, a vizier 3 times under the Caliph al-Muqtadir, was fond of fine clothes such as turbans, cloths worn over the turban, and or a kisa, all made of Egyptian linen called dabiqi. The Caliph al-Muqtadir himself sometimes wore a kaftan of tustari cloth. The warehouses of the Abbasid caliphs were stuffed with thousands of pieces of clothing of various kinds, as attested by the Book of Gifts and Rarities, the Kitab al-Hadaya wa al-Tuhaf, which was probably written by the 12th century Egyptian author Qadi ibn al-Zubair. After the death of Harun al-Rashid, his son Amin had an inventory of his father's wardrobe compiled by his vizier al-Fadl ibn al-Rabi'a, which contained tens of thousands of items such as furnishings, suits of armor, and garments including turbans, various types of shirts and cloaks, trousers, fur-lined items, capes, and hoods. Al-Fadl was surprised when he made the inventory. I brought in the scribes and the treasury keepers and kept on counting for 4 months. I had never imagined that the treasuries of the caliphate would contain all the things I oversaw there. Another vivid account of clothing is provided by a Baghdadian author called Abul Qasim, who probably lived in the 9th or 10th century, in a satirical account of the dress and interior decoration of the citizens of Isfahan. It is worth quoting the passage on clothing here in full. By Allah, I do not see a single one of you wearing a garment of reddish dabiqi, nor dabqawi, nor of qirati zuhairi, which is perhaps when he meets a stuff with which is embroidered all over, in patterns in the shape of coins called qirat, which is a fraction of a dinar, and was produced in a quarter of the city of Baghdad, nor reddish woven stuff, nor Adan cloaks, nor garments of qasab linen, of Samanud and Damsisi and Tunisi and Dimyati, nor yet Mujalali stuff, nor figured material of brocade with woven gold and the intermingled ambergris, with beautiful markings as if it were woven of the blossoms of the spring, or yet transparent shinzi stuffs like the thin air or the mirage, nor napkins which are used for wiping the mouth in polite assemblies, of qasab linen, of unbleached material with a border, or nor striped materials with maghribi, gold, or atabi dabiqi with a border and embroidered with gold. You see, it is rather involved, in fact, and incredibly diverse and hybrid in many ways. So kind of really to use a word that some people love to, multiverse environment from things from everywhere. What seems to be clear from the few references provided here is that the Abbasid world was mad about clothing and fiercely international in the types of fabrics traded between Baghdad and the provinces, but also the larger overseas networks. This is indicated by the common use of geographic references in describing fabrics. We get a very good sense of the sheer variety by looking at the Tiraz and Tiraz style textiles that have survived in Egyptian graves and which are the subject of this book and catalogue. Despite being grave goods and hence perhaps not reflecting the whole variety of clothing and textiles used during the early caliphates, they do show a huge variety of cloth types and qualities, including products that were made across the Islamic world and had reached Egypt through international trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, and official government requisitions. And I try to sort of, divide them up into chapters relating to these different geographical places where the textiles that were found in Egypt all came from. Visual representations of caliphal dress from the high point of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century are almost absent. A unique portrait of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil can be seen on the obverse of a silver dirham minted in 241 Hijri which is equivalent to 855 to 6 CE, by his son al-Mu'taz, which is now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. The coin was probably a presentation coin minted to mark specific anniversaries, which was then dispersed to chosen individuals. The shoulder-length portrait comprises a frontal view of the caliph. Prominent facial features are his large eyes, nose, moustache, and double-pointed beard, as well as ears from which are suspended what appear to be earrings, and a kafia covering his head, held by what looks like an agal, a modern-day agal, made from a twisted rope. He wears a robe with a pearl band collar. The caliph's headgear is markedly Bedouin. Rather than pushing a public image based on foreign models, as seen under the Umayyads, perhaps al-Mutawakkil sought to assert Arabness in an environment where Arabs were a minority, outnumbered by Persian administration and a Turkish slave army. In this context, dress was used to carry a political message. What might have gone on behind palace walls, where only select courtiers were ever able to be in the presence of the caliph, is of course another matter. Here the dress code was surely more culturally diverse, as related in the literary sources. This is also the picture that emerges by looking at what has survived from the decoration of Abbasid palaces. Hardly ever discussed in the literature is the evidence recovered during the excavations at Samarra in Iraq between 1911 and 1914, and recorded in sketchbooks by the archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, now held at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In 836, the Caliph al-Mu'tasim moved his court to the newly founded capital at Samarra, where he built extensive palace complexes along the river Tigris. The city was further extended under al-Mutawakkil with a large congregational mosque and a palace for his son, the future Caliph al-Mu'taz. The palaces were decorated with polychrome wall stucco, but also cycles of wall paintings featuring floral, zoomorphic, and anthropomorphic decoration. The paintings comprised figures the paintings comprising figures are mostly of scenes connected to courtly pastimes and leisure. A well-known painting found at the Harem at the Dar al-Khilafa, also called the Jawsaq al-Haqqani, the main palace of the Abbasid caliphs at Samarra, features two female dancers holding large bottles pouring drink into cups. The women's costumes are composed of hip-length shirts worn with long skirts of the same colors, red and blue, and they have patterned borders. Both women wear scarves draped front to back over their shoulders and suspended over their upper arms. Another fragment of a painting found in the same site features a female figure wearing a tightly fitted long-sleeve dress in red with accentuated borders around collar and left sleeve. The base fabric decorated with yellow and black leopard dots. A tapestry woven wool fragment in the Textile Museum, Washington, once part of a sumptuous furnishing fabric produced in Upper Egypt during the Tulunid period, features a figure wearing a dotted garment similar to that of the painted figure at Samarra. The Tulunid dynasty was founded by the Turkic governor Ahmed ibn Tulun, who had been sent to Egypt from Samarra under the Caliph al-Mu'taz and eventually established independent control over Egypt's military and economy. Louis Mackey suggested that the Tulunids adopted the court dress style favored at Samarra, as is clear when one compares the dress of the two figures. A further set of fragments fragments features female figures dressed only in polychrome patterned izars fastened around the waist, similar to the bathing figures found at Qasr Amra discussed before, and those seen on a number of Sasanian silver gilt ewers. While the focus in these is on the various patterns, such as scales and lattices, the izar, seen on yet another fragment, has its focus on the way the pleats are suspended down the figure's legs with the patterned border at the hem. A very different set of images on pointed jars was found near the throne room of the palace. All of them feature male bearded figures with moustaches seen in front of view, wearing what look like striped kaffirs. The one best preserved wears a long brownish kameez decorated with a lattice design accentuated with blue and black cross shapes, with a blue and white striped shawl flung over his shoulders, and holds a staff with both hands. The figure and its costume are reminiscent of the individual presented on the medal of al-Mutawakkil discussed previously, a decidedly Arab approach to dress. The function of these jars within the court context remains a puzzle, though. A stark contrast to the austerity of those figures is provided by a fragment of a wall painting also found near the throne room. It features a standing figure, possibly turbaned, in Persian or Central Asian dress. That is, a green-tailored coat made from a fabric patterned with red and yellow flowers, tightened round the waist with a belt and worn over a pair of pinkish and dotted baggy trousers. Similar outfits can often be found in figures decorating luster-painted ceramics from the 10th century, which have been attributed to the workshops of al-Basra in southern Iraq, which we can see here on this side. Oops, so sorry, I didn't mean that. Oops, oh, what am I doing? There. That's the luster dish here. No garments or outfits have survived from Abbasid Iraq other than what was found in Egypt. Mostly textiles made from cotton with a small embroidered inscription, examples of which are seen in the book that you can have a look at later. These speak of a vivid exchange of goods between the center of the Abbasid Empire and Egypt, its main economic powerhouse. Only one Egyptian inscribed fragment was found during the excavations at Samarra. It must have been a random survival. After the court had shifted back to Baghdad at the end of the 9th century, the textiles found in Egypt are obviously not representative of Abbasid court costume alone, and it is very likely that we are missing the largest portion of what must have once been a stunningly colourful and luxurious dress culture is what we've seen. And this little fragment here, unfortunately in a terrible photocopy, is actually in a lovely photograph in the book. Oops, I'm going too far again. Go back. Back. Yes. The Buyids and the Seljuks. Let me know if it's too long. We can shorten it. I think we've got, yeah, we're getting there. At 2/3, right? But we can cut it short a little bit, it's fine. In the 10th century, Abbasid power began to decline with the rise of Shi'ism in the eastern provinces and the establishment of an Iranian dynasty founded by Ali ibn Buya, who in 934 conquered Fars and made Shiraz his capital. In 945, his youngest brother Ahmed ibn Buya conquered Iraq and established his capital at Baghdad, after taking control of the Abbasid administration as Amir al-Umara, but retaining the Caliph al-Mustakfi as vassal figurehead. Al-Mustakfi awarded honorific titles to several members of the Buyid family, including that of Ma'izza Dawla, which means glorifier of the state, for Ahmed. After several Buyid emirs ruling over Baghdad, in 988, Abu Nasir Firuz Kharshad, a son of the Amir Adadu Dawla, also known by his honorific title Baha'a Dawla, splendor of the state, took control of Baghdad. The Buyids were looking back to Iranian customs and at the same time had to straddle Abbasid court protocol. This probably included dress codes. A gold medal issued at Baghdad in 965, which Hijri, equivalent to 975-6, by Izza Dawla, portrays on the obverse a seated prince cross-legged, holding a cup and being attended on either side by two individuals. The reverse of the medal shows a lute player seated cross-legged. The prince, as well as the lute player, wear tailored garments of the type found at Samarra, discussed above in the paintings. A related gold medal in the Freer Gallery of Art, however undescribed, shows a seated prince on the obverse, wearing a crown and a tailored open coat held at the waist with a belt and trousers. The obverse of the medal depicts a crowned princely figure as a falconer mounted on horseback, again wearing a coat open in the front, fastened with a belt over trousers. Abbasid customs relating to robes of honor were discussed in the Rusum Dar al-Khilafa by the 10th century author Hilal al-Sabi. In one chapter devoted to the investiture of Adadu Dawla, Hilal distinguished between robes of honor for commanders of the army, those for the vizier, and those distributed on a regional level. The passage provides information on two issues: the role of inscriptions on vestments, and the varying grades of vestments according to office. Hilal's descriptions make it clear that vestments were graded by rank, distinguished not only by the decoration on the garments, but also by various additional insignia. Army generals, for example, received the most elaborate vestments: a plain black turban, two black garments, one with a hoop and one without, a red gilded or embroidered Susi cloth, and a loose and sleeveless dabiqi garment with a frontal opening. In addition, a sword, two quivers, a standard, and horses were presented. When the Seljuk Turks swept over the eastern and central Islamic lands in the 11th century, they not only brought with them their idea of Sunni orthodoxy, but also their traditions of clothing that stood in some contrast to those that had developed under the Abbasids. The figures of attendant courtiers in the wall paintings of the audience hall in the Ghaznavid Palace of Lashkari Bazar in Helmand province, southern Afghanistan, are dressed in long-sleeved coats that are fastened on the left side with a collar folded over to the right, held together around the waist with sashes that are suspended down the front. One robe is decorated with a pattern of teardrops, the other with a pattern of large roundels comprising borders with floral scrolling and scrolls in the central panel. There are the teardrops here, and there are the large roundels here. And then there are the sashes. I mean, they're very prominent here. The figures, furthermore, wear trousers and boots and hold maces in their right hands. They coincide very closely to a description of an audience in 429, which is 1038, of the Ghaznavid Sultan Mas'ud of Ghazna. By the contemporary historian of Mas'ud, the Ghaznavid civil servant Abul Fadl al-Bayhaqi. In the passage, he describes the courtiers and their dress in some detail. All around the hall, standing against the panels, were the household gholams with robes of Sakhalatun, Baghdadi, and Isfahani cloth, 2 pointed caps, gold-mounted waist sashes, pendants, and golden maces in their hands. On the dais itself, to both left and right of the throne, were 10 gholams with 4 sectioned caps on their heads, heavy and bejeweled waist sashes and bejeweled sword belts. In the middle of the hall were 2 lines of gholams. One line was standing against the wall, wearing 4 sectioned caps. In their hands they held arrows and swords, and they had quivers and bow cases. There was another line positioned down the center of the hall with 2 pointed caps, heavy, silver-mounted waist sashes, pendants, and silver maces in their hands. The gholams of both these lines all wore cloaks of Shushtari brocade. Several polychrome stucco figures have survived from archaeological contexts that also broadly conform to the description of the gholam's costume provided by Abul Fadl, which I've just quoted. These have been linked to the kind of courtly context provided by the paintings of the audience hall of Lashkari Bazaar. They have been attributed to Western Iran under Seljuk rule between 1050 and 1150, perhaps under the rule of Sultan Sanjar. The Seljuks were, like the Ghaznavids, of Turkic origin and competed with them over areas in eastern Iran. Perhaps the most prominent of these sculptures are the 2 at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. These figures are characterized by full frontal posture, Sasanian-style crowns or headbands, patterned knee-length cloaks studded with jewel-like ornaments, Tiraz bands with legible but non-historical inscriptions. So these are the Tiraz bands here. They do say something. I think al-Mulk. And then they have jewelry around the neck, belts with suspended sashes and decorated swords held diagonally in front. Prominent colors are light blue, red, and traces of gilding. While the painted figures at Lashkari Bazaar that we've just seen are shown in 3/4 profile, the stucco figures here look straight onto the viewer, which has led to the proposition that they were intended to accompany the ruler's throne. The fact that all feature cloaks with such prominent Tiraz bands, as well as crowns and jeweled ornaments, points to a princely context for sure. An important surviving garment related to the type of cloak seen in the stucco figures is in the Sarikhani collection. It is composed of a weft-faced compound twirl in dark blue silk, decorated with a pattern of golden roundels, comprising a border of floriated kufic, benedictory phrases containing 2 confronted birds. This is the one here. And it's interesting because actually there is also, I learned a few months ago when I was in Riyadh, not in Riyadh, in Jeddah, there is a coat with a fur trimmed rim that is made of the very same fabric. And that must have been a set, in fact, which was divided up at some point when these things were found and then traded in the art trade. And there is also a cushion cover that belongs to that. But this is really interesting, and this is beryl, because it is completely decomposed on the back, brown stains. Now we come to the Abbasid revival. Images of seated rulers persisted among the heirs of the Seljuks long after the Seljuk Empire had disintegrated and through what has been referred to as the Abbasid revival from 1118 to 1258. A very important player in northern Iraq in the period before the mid-13th century Mongol invasions was the Amir Badr ad-Din Lu'lu, originally an Armenian slave and later successor to the Zangid Emirate of Mosul. Recognized by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustansir, he carried the title al-Malik al-Rahim. Apart from a series of metal objects inscribed with his name and titles, he is remembered in a series of patrons' portraits executed for the frontispieces of copies of the Kitab al-Aghani, the Book of Songs, originally written by the 10th century Baghdadian poet Abul Faraj al-Isfahani. One type represents the haloed Badr ad-Din Lu'lu, seated cross-legged on a high chair, attended by members of his court to either side. The other shows Badr ad-Din as a falconer mounted on a horse. In both, he wears a lavishly patterned coat in blue and gold with inscribed golden Tiraz bands on both upper sleeves that feature his name legibly in black nusq. And that's really interesting because you can see that right here. It actually says Badr ad-Din Lu'lu. So he also wears a pair of similarly patterned trousers and a pointed hat with a fur lining, emphasizing his Turkic affiliations. And this is nice because it actually the fur on that robe that I've just mentioned is very, very, very rare indeed. And so this kind of confirms some of what we see here. A glimpse into the dress culture. Let's go on to the next one. A glimpse into the dress culture of the cultured urban bourgeoisie in late Abbasid Baghdad is provided by the illustrations of the maqamat of Abu Muhammad ibn al-Qasim ibn Ali bin Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Hariri of Basra. He was a poet, linguist, and civil servant under the Seljuks. Two manuscript copies of the work are particularly well known, one in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, the other in the Oriental Institute of the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. The copy in the Bibliothèque Nationale was copied and illustrated in Baghdad by Yahya ibn Mahmud al-Wasiti around 1236-7. The stories are tales of adventures of the hero Abu Zayd from Saruj and are told by a certain al-Harith, a merchant who travels between places, some of them exotic. The miniatures are lively illustrations of the text and exude a certain drama. Most striking is the sheer variety of dress, codes, and color and pattern for both female and male protagonists. Even though the copies date from a time just before the Abbasid Caliphate came to an end in Baghdad due to the Mongol invasions, it seems that they reflect a varied and complex society that had retained many of its traits from earlier times, as described in 9th and 10th century texts, as those of Abu Tayyib Muhammad al-Washa mentioned at the beginning. The exuberance of the various shirts, cloaks, and shawls is especially noticeable. They are worn with a variety of headdress, such as turbans with long sashes. Also, the differentiation of social and ethnic groups is expressed prominently in clothing. The costume of government officials or members of the religious elite stands out as being more layered and complex. Golden bands decorate borders and sleeves, perhaps a reference to inscribed Tiraz bands. You can see some of that here. It's quite nice. There, here the borders and these very large sleeves. There are some golden bands, and it's just a sheer variety of all these different patterns and colors, and it's kind of a bit of a what shall I say, party. There is also a very clear notion of Arabness among the urban middle class in those paintings. Despite the fact that Baghdad previously had been effectively seduced subdued, not seduced, sorry. Subdued by Iranian and Turkic governments for a good 150 years. Well, maybe they were seduced, I don't know. The weight here is on types of dress that look back to earlier periods when the Abbasids were at their zenith, rather than the foreign fashions favored by the Buyid or Seljuk elite. A certain Arab notion of dress seems to have also been favored among the elite of the Fatimid dynasty, who ruled Egypt from 973 to 1171. One of the earliest representations of Fatimid courtly life is a marble relief in the Bardo Museum in Tunis, which shows a ruler seated cross-legged and holding a conical cup, attended by a female musician playing a flute. The ruler wears a tunic with long sleeves decorated with epigraphic bands. You can see those here very prominently. An ornamented belt at the waist and a winged Sasanian-style crown. The female figure wears a long shirt-like dress, also covered with bands on the sleeves. In a way, the representation of rulership carries on the precedent set by the Abbasids, a hybrid of Arab and Iranian attitudes to dress. The marble relief dates most likely from before the Fatimids took Egypt and established the center of their caliphate in Cairo. It probably was once located in a palatial complex in their capital of Al-Mahdiya, founded by the Caliph al-Mahdi. Once the Fatimids had established their capital in Cairo, following the conquest of Egypt under al-Mu'izz, it seems that a courtly style developed that was more refined, more lavish and extravagant than that of earlier times. While the great Fatimid palaces in Cairo have disappeared, there is quite a wealth of representations of courtly activity in luxury works of art of the 11th and 12th centuries. A carved ivory frame, which might once have belonged to a piece of furniture, is now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Islamic Art in Berlin, and it features a wealth of figures feasting and hunting, accompanied by musicians and attendants. The lively activity and drama of the figures is underlined by great attention to dress. Patterned cloaks and tunics, baggy trousers, wide flowing sleeves, not unlike what we see in the illustrations of the maqamat, which I've just discussed. Similar representations once decorated the palaces of the Fatimids, as is indicated by surviving wooden beams, now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. Fatimid luster ceramics also feature similar courtly figures. The fine fragment of a luster-painted dish at the Benaki Museum in Athens features a seated musician wearing an ornamented robe with epigraphic Tiraz bands on the sleeves. The figure is suggestive of the sheer splendor of the Fatimid court. That the Fatimid court style trickled down into the middle classes may be indicated by a painting in an architectural Muqarnas fragment from al-Sabah, now at the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, which is this one here. It features a figure seated cross-legged, raising a beaker, wearing a tunic with a floral pattern over a pair of trousers. Prominent are the carefully wound turban, but also the shawl worn over its back and its ends flying out from underneath the arms, which is, you can see here, sort of very fashionably, sort of what you see today, even still to some extent, you know. You go to Paris. Let's see the next one. Epigraphic Tiraz bands can also be found in a small drawing on paper of two palace guards in Cairo. One wears a Turkic cloak, the other is a Middle Eastern figure in a tunic worn over trousers. This is this one here. There's the trousers. We're still doing okay. The Fatimid treasury accounts, as described in historical literature, show how diverse textiles at the Fatimid court actually were. In contrast to archaeological Tiraz textiles that are mostly made of linen or cotton cloth, with silk used only sparsely. And again, you can see some of those in the book, and they are really quite in contrast to what we know from the sources, as described, for example, by the Fatimid civil servant Qadi Rashid ibn al-Zubair in his book Kitab al-Dhakha'ir wa al-Tuhaf, a book used and quoted by al-Maqrizi in his Khitat. But it's an earlier work that was used later on, that was could have quoted later on by al-Maqrizi, who was, of course, working in the writing in the Mamluk period. The contents of the Khazan al-Kiswa, the treasury of clothing, contain not only the wardrobe of the caliph and his family, but also items distributed to the various ranks of courtiers. Although these accounts do not describe the appearance of garments in detail, they do provide some data about materials. The outfits described most carefully are those of the caliph, his brother Abul Fadl Ja'far, and the senior princess. These contain the largest amount of individual items, 10 or 11 for the caliph, 5 for his brother, and 16 for the princess. Linings and garments worn beneath other items, including tunic-like garments such as the ghalala and the wasitani, appear to have been made of linen, as were mantles, and in some cases the linen fabric contains silk, though whether this was tapestry woven or embroidered, we don't know. The materials of what appear to be mostly outer garments are not stated in the lists concerning the caliph's outfit, but the outer garments in all 4 outfits all used large amounts of gold, the value of which was considerable. The caliph's first ceremonial costume contained 2 robes and a turban, which together were made with around 1,066 mithqal, which is about 4.5 kilograms of gold. And according to the current gold price, this is a rather hefty sum, I would think. The gold in the thob amounted to 375 mithqals, that is 1.5 kilograms of gold, and in his turban to 325, which is another 1.5 kilos. Whether the ground fabric of these items was silk is unknown. Although they were much less detailed, the lists outlining the outfits of relatives and palace officials also mention a large number of outfits that were either made of silk, gilded, or gold embroidered. Only the lowlier ranks of the court hierarchy, such as servants, captains, and sailors of the caliphal barges, were given Alexandrian, Sus, and Damietta cloth, which may well have been linen fabrics produced in these centers. It is clear that gold-decorated textiles and silks, but also plain linens or linens woven with silk, were part of the palace wardrobe, depending on garment types and rank of the wearer. Yet surviving Tiraz textiles misrepresent this picture, giving almost no evidence for homogeneous silk and very little for the use of gold. Since gold was a precious commodity, it is unsurprising that textiles woven or embroidered with it were much more expensive than textiles without. Looking back to the Fatimid period, the Mamluk author Ibn Dokmak, for example, stated, while describing the products of the various centers, textile centers in the Nile Delta, that in Tunis and Damietta, a cloth or garment embroidered in gold could be worth about 1,000 dinars, whereas one without was only worth 100 or 200 dinars in comparison. One of the few references to Tiraz bands is found in a statement of Ibn Abi Tai, who commented that, "I have heard a certain person say that he was present at the investiture of Al-Qasr, which used to take place in summer and winter. the value of the stuffs given away when being more than 600,000 dinars. The emirs used to be invested with garments of dabiqi and turbans with gold Tiraz borders. These two items worth 500 dinars. The greatest emirs were invested with necklaces, bracelets, and ornamented swords. In 516 Hijri, the various articles upon which money was spent came to 14,305 pieces. So incredibly lush. I mean, this was that they spent an awful lot of money on clothing. Relatively few Tiraz textiles have survived, which were either woven or embroidered with gold, the majority from the Fatimid period. One of these is the so-called Veil of St. Anne, which dates from 1095 to 7 and represents one of the best preserved complete garments from the Fatimid period with a caliphal inscription. Preserved in the Church of St. Anne in Apt in southern France, the veil was probably brought to France during the early Crusades and served as a sacred relic of St. Anne, whose cult had developed in France during the 12th century. Rimbaud de Simian, the Lord of Apt, Guillaume de Sabran, and Isoire, the town's bishop, were all known to have taken part in the First Crusade. The Veil of St. Anne is a large rectangular sheet cloth comprising a full loom width and length, and so it's completely intact. It bears a series of inscriptions that mention the names and titles of Caliph al-Musta'ali and his vizier al-Afdal. This, as well as the famous textile production center Damietta in Lower Egypt, as its center of production. The veil is made from a very lightweight and sheer undyed linen-based fabric, perhaps like the sharb pieces that are so celebrated in the historical accounts. Both fringes of the length are decorated with tripartite bands featuring the caliphal inscriptions. The central portion carries another band which serves as a linkage to two small roundels that contain a pair of harpies encircled by an inscription with the name of the vizier. The band terminates at the selvage of one side in a large roundel containing a pair of adored sphinxes, again encircled by text. This roundel extends into two volutes on either side and could well have been at the center of the whole garment worn over the back shoulder. As you can see here, this is how it's been sort of proposed. So it's not stitched, so it's just really placed over the shoulder. But how exactly the veil was worn is not entirely sure. We really don't know, and it's a bit of conjecture there. As there are no signs of tailoring, some scholars have proposed that it could have been folded to create a garment similar to the modern bisht, a light overcoat. In that case, the two bands would have been attached to the volutes to form the front of the garment, and the selvage of that side would have been closed up. But to be honest, we don't know. Of similar size to the veil, yet far less luxurious in its use of materials, is another complete loom width and length that survived as a relic in France after the Crusades, the so-called Shroud of Cadouin at the Abbey of Cadouin in the Dordogne. First mentioned in archival records in 1214, it was believed to have come into the possession of the Bishop of Puy, Ademar de Monteuil, after the capture of Antioch during the First Crusade. As a holy relic, it was associated with Jesus Christ himself, and was long considered to be the Holy Shroud, the cloth believed to have enshrouded the body of Jesus. Definitely impossible, because of the date that is contained in the inscription. Like the Veil of St. Anne, the shroud carries caliphal inscriptions mentioning the Caliph al-Musta'ali. but unlike the former, it does not have a central band nor gold thread. The fabric also seems lesser in terms of quality. The fact that these two textiles are the only examples of caliphal production to have survived intact as objects is considerable, as they crossed over cultures and religious practice and were repurposed and reassigned new symbolic meanings. Only a handful of complete garments have survived in Egyptian burials. Perhaps the earliest is a small burial tunic in the Textile Museum, Washington, exhibited currently in those galleries there. And it's also discussed there in the books. It is inscribed with an embroidered Tiraz in the name of the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir. And the inscription here is interestingly on the back side of the sleeve and going and running upside down. So, and that poses some questions, of course. It is possible that this item was first tailored and subsequently embroidered, in which case the embroiderer did not care about the inscription. However, I think really it is more likely that this tunic was tailored out of a larger sheet that already was inscribed, and the inscribed area was reserved for the sleeve intentionally, even though it was the wrong way round. Individually cut sections of cloth were sewn together, but the main part of the tunic formed from an oblong piece of cloth with a slit cut into the midsection to form the head opening. The sleeves are short and attached to the midsection of the main cloth. In order to provide the tunic with enough volume to cover the body of its wearer, which actually was a child, it is very, very small. It's only about this big. Two trapezoidal pieces of cloth were inserted between the main body and the sleeves, and these are the little trapezoidal bits, so to make it a little bit more baggy under the arms. And there are several fragments here where we have the evidence of pockets. And here again, if this is a shirt pocket, then the inscription runs the wrong way around. So again, this one is Fatimid one, that's an Abbasid one here, another pocket here, is tailored out of larger sheets. So these were kind of repurposed, upcycled in a sense, to use a modern term, to be used perhaps in life and then later in burial. And there's two other pieces here. These are actually armbands, most likely, because the seam goes all the way down. So they're really like the ones we saw in the paintings in the Maqamat, for example. Two very rare complete adult linen tunics from Egypt, one in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, the other in the al-Sabah collection, show that both adult and children's tunics, like the ones we've discussed before, were similar in shape and construction. And the one in the Ashmolean Museum is interesting because it was carbon dated, and the date that came out was 930 plus minus 35 years. So it sort of could be the end time roundabout the Fatimid conquest of Egypt, just before or maybe just after. And they are also constructed in very much a similar way. They're both related in their inscription and the way it's executed, but they're also related to the earlier tunic we've seen in the way they are constructed. So they've got these trapezoid pieces put in under the sleeves, for example, here particularly. I'm not sure here, but they've got very wide sleeves, and these are adult tunics, so they are really, they're as big as me. This one has a collar, that one doesn't. So this is a little bit more elaborate. One last example to consider, and there we are, close to the end, is an iconic garment that perhaps offers a visual memento of the splendor of Fatimid court costume, because we really haven't got any of that fantastic gold and, 3 or 4 kilos of gold and pearls and so forth. We just don't have it. But the ceremonial robe of the first Norman king of Sicily, Roger II, made in the royal treasury, the Khazanah al-Malikiya in Palermo, the Madinat al-Siqiliya, most likely by Muslim craftsmen, inscribed in Arabic and dated to 528 Hijri, which is 1133 to 34. Its bright red silk base is embroidered on a large scale with gold thread and pearls, as well as encrusted with gold sheet and precious stones. As a garment, it links 3 clothing traditions: medieval European, Byzantine, and Islamic. In doing so, it embodies the Norman program of, to use the Spanish term, convivencia, on an island that had been at the crossroads of diverse cultures for centuries. While firmly rooted in the culture of Christian Europe, the Normans in Sicily adapted to and adopted many aspects of Byzantine and Islamic culture that suited their identity and lifestyle as rulers within the political landscape of the Mediterranean at